Well, welcome everybody, and welcome back to LTAD Chat to today's guests, Steve Boyle and Nate Baldwin. Today is January 1st, 2021, and we are going to reflect on the past few years and project forward on our efforts in this space of long-term athletic development, youth sports, and physical literacy. We did this same episode a few weeks ago with Tony Moreno and Rick Howard, and we wanted to follow up and get other perspectives to be able to compare, contrast, and perhaps come to consensus, and also even broaden our conversation in this space. So like Tony and Rick, Steve and Nate continue to push forward with raising awareness and dissemination and implementation of long-term athletic development in their own spheres. Steve as a consultant and the director of 241 Sports, and Nate as a former Park and Recs administrator and now working with League Apps, which is a technology in the youth sports space. Both have also been aligned and recognized by the Aspen Institute Sport Project Play, which just issued its State of Play 2020 a few days ago, and perhaps something that may come up in this episode as well. So again, I want us to take some time to provide an update where we are at the end of 2020. What is the state of long-term athletic development? But perhaps before we begin the discussion, guys, I'd like each of you to provide an answer to this commonly asked question. What is long-term athletic development?
Steve, that sounds like a question directed at you, so go ahead.
One of the things that's just fascinating about this space, I think, and you started in your intro, Joe, and first of all, Happy New Year to everybody, and thanks for having us on, is the idea of coming to consensus is so challenging, right? So certainly, I think if we were to look at just long-term athlete development, I love when Tony uses the analogy of a slow cooker, but I had the luxury of working with Glenn Young, who many of you probably know is really well recognized and respected in the physical education space. And with myself coming from more of a counseling and coaching background, we had the opportunity a couple years back to work for almost 2 years on developing a program for a pre-K through secondary, all the way through postgraduate school, called Whittle School and Studios, that was starting a campus in Washington, D.C. and in Shenzhen, China. And so what Glenn and I did was we took the concept of physical literacy and the concept of long-term athlete development, and we did battle. Like, we went after it. And really what we had to do is come to some level of consensus first on what is physical literacy, because there's a lot of stuff out there right now, and actually over the past 5 or 6 years, in terms of sort of the bastardization of the term and the use of it in ways that, and I've really evolved in my thinking of it. Like, I used to think of physical literacy as an outcome, and now I'm completely opposed to thinking of it as an outcome. And that while there certainly can be recognized benchmarks, I think we get caught up in that stuff too much. So I'm giving a long-term answer to a long-term athlete development question, but I want to share this screen to just give it a little bit of context, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So let me see if we can get you guys on this. So can you guys see this? Is it loading for you?
Yeah, we're good.
All right. So basically, for those of you familiar with the concept of physical literacy, is if you look at the outer ring, that's the physical literacy cycle. And I want you to understand, like, Glenn and I, when I say we did battle, this was probably weeks long, coming up and fighting over words and how we would do this. And so one of the things about the physical literacy cycle is that people can enter this at any point, right? And for many, it's coming in with motivation and enjoyment. If it's fun, you're probably going to participate. What was interesting, we were presenting this, and we were presenting to parents by department, and we presented right before the math and science department, and the head of math and science stole our slide and put this up, and he said, "You see where these guys put movement?" He goes, "I want you to put math and science there." And basically what he was saying was the competence piece really that's the content, right? That's ability in anything. But if you are competent in movement, then you're going to develop confidence, which then makes it more fun, which then encourages participation. He said, same with math and science. There's so many people that say, hey, I'm not a math science person, and therefore I don't have any confidence in it, and therefore I don't enjoy it. Why would I want to participate in it? And then they leave math and science forever. And so it was really neat to sort of see how this is applicable everywhere. But when we look at long-term athlete development, I would say that's the sort of the inner part here. And so, you know, certainly if you were to look at the Canadian Sport for Life in terms of, you know, the stages of traditional long-term athlete development, this is somewhat similar, but we crafted it specifically for a school, knowing that schools are put into departments. You sort of have your pre-K or your early learning, then your lower school, then your middle school, then your upper school. So we decided to, you know, obviously me more through a sports lens and Glenn more through a physical education lens, is to use the word exploration, all right, for early learning, right? And we fought over these particular words. We try to make this infographic as simple as possible. Fundamentals, which we often will talk about being the building blocks, right? So there's a discovery and exploration, and fundamentals, it's like, all right, this is where we're going to actually start teaching some things. Then now you have this bucket of skills. Now you're going to sample a bunch of different sports or sample a bunch of different activities. And middle school, we find is a good time to do that. And then, all right, how am I going to use all this stuff? So now I'm going to actually maybe have some specificity, but also I could continue to sample, but I got to narrow a little bit. And notice that this leaf right here for recreation crosses all four, right? And then we don't do anything where we would think about high level until middle or upper school. But the outcome is really lifelong journey of well-being, all right? And so when I think about long-term athlete development, I can't separate it from physical literacy development, right? I have to see those two things as interconnected. But at the end of the day, and Glenn, I got to give credit for this phrase, is that we're trying to create a disposition to be active for life, right? And so whether it's through long-term athlete development or physical literacy development, that's hopefully what's going to be the outcome of all that. So apologize for the long-winded answer, but I hope that makes some sense in terms of where my background in education and athletic coaching comes in, and had married it with Glenn's strong background in physical education. You guys have any questions about this or comments before I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, Steve, my comment is I'm really glad that you talked about how long-term athlete or long-term athletic development is interwoven with physical literacy. I think too often in this conversation, people have them separated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And this is coming down to semantics and operational definitions as well, as opposed to what really happens in practice.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and we'll probably get to this a little later in the conversation, what I have found is coming from a non-physical education background and not strength and conditioning, but more from a true sort of multi-sport coach and multi-sport athlete background, is I leaned more towards that piece coupled with my counseling. So what has always attracted me to the concept of physical literacy, and now I often don't say physical literacy without physical literacy development, because I think that's what we need to think about it as a development model, is that I really am drawn to the more effective pieces, right? So the confidence and motivation piece, that's where I feel that's what differentiates physical education. It's not, there's a more holistic approach in my mind when we think about physical literacy as components of competence, confidence, and motivation to be active for life, where background, at least from my perception, was that it was more just on ability, right? Just movement skills, and not coupling it with the more social emotional pieces, if you will.
Yeah, super. And Steve, I've always appreciated your unique background. And as you said, as a, you know, non-exercise science, physical education person as well, when Nate, you kind of fall within that realm as well. And I've always appreciated your lens on this, especially, you know, when you were working in parks and recs as well, because I think it's a similar lens as what Steve has provided, but if you have to go and define, a parent asks you, what is this long-term athlete or long-term athletic development? How do you respond to that question?
I
How
think
do you define it?
I think lens is a good term because that's the term I was going to use too. I do look at this through a slightly less academic and more practical lens, I would say. Um, and in the work that I've done with coaching kids myself, or teaching new coaches how to coach kids properly, it's always been kind of done through the lens of this is what is psychologically appropriate, or this is what's developmentally appropriate for kids in general at their particular life stage. It never really had anything to do with the athletic component or the strength and conditioning component. Whenever I was dealing with lesson planning or training or answering questions or building the foundation for a sustainable program, it was always done through that psychological or human development type of perspective. And I'm a relative newcomer to the concept of long-term athletic development. It was almost kind of by accident that I was exposed to it, and exposed to individuals like yourself and all the others that you've had on this podcast. And I feel fortunate to have made those connections. But the mind-opening thing was that all of these concepts that I had been leading with in my private work on the ground matched really well with the concepts of long-term athletic development. So I would kind of define it that way. And it might be a simplistic definition, but I would say it's where athletic strength training and conditioning concepts blend with psychological and age appropriate child development concepts. It's where those things match up and provide a sustainable, progressive pathway for kids to incorporate physical activity as a foundation of their lifestyle throughout their life. So it kind of builds on some of the concepts that Steve shared, especially with that chart, which was fantastic. And I think it contains all those critical elements and components. But I think it's like I just said, and to reiterate that, I think it's that blending of physical concepts with psychological and developmental concepts. And that makes it a really powerful thing. It's kind of a guiding light for program development on the ground. When you're thinking about how to structure, what to train on, what to focus on, that really does provide a light. I spend a lot of time, dealing with my own kids. And one thing we like to do, or, my youngest son has a big box of cardboard blocks. And what we like to do is build a tower to see how tall we can get that thing. So we all know what we have to do with that. We have to build, if we just start stacking block on block on block, if we make a misstep, that whole thing is going to topple over. Not unlike athletic development, or not unlike even just child development. If we go too fast or layer on too much, we disrupt the process and we have to start over. We all know that if we're trying to build a foundation, or if we're trying to build a tower of blocks from the floor to the ceiling, we've got to start with a nice wide base. And we've got to go at an appropriate pace with an appropriate strategy to get that thing as high as we can. And if any misstep occurs along that way, the whole thing will topple down. And I tend to think of child development in the same way. When they're young, we're trying to build that broad base of interests, capabilities. We're trying to build confidence. We're trying to layer all that stuff in that base. And then once we have that base set, it's strong. And then we can start to layer on, those fine details as we work our way up towards the ceiling. And it have something whacking it with its tail, and it's not going to fall over. And I think similarly, I think we can think similarly about long-term athletic development. If we're going about it in the right way, with the right pace, with the age appropriate, developmentally appropriate skills and experiences, we're going to build a foundation in those kids, who are then going to become, functioning adults who value those activities and value that experience into adulthood. And ultimately that's what we want. So I think long-term athletic development takes that lifespan approach, beyond just those fleeting 4 years of high school that we like to talk about, or those fleeting 3 or 4 years of college competition that we like to focus so much on. It takes a long view of it.
Yeah, I love that analogy about building with the blocks.
Yeah.
So that was super. And as I'm listening to both of you, I want to thank both of you for keeping us grounded, in that this is more than the physical athletic development of individuals, and that, this human development, these psychosocial aspects are so critical. So I really appreciate you guys' comments and focus around that. Next question here is, what do you think are some of the big advances that we've made in this space in the last few years?
I'll take a stab at it, Nate, first, if that's all right. I mean, it depends on the day you ask me whether or not I feel like we've made as many advances as I'd like, right? Certainly we formed 241 Sports back in 2008, but it really came about as a result of changes I was seeing from my early coaching days in New York City and Seattle in the early 90s. And some days it really feels like we're running into the wind, right? And often direction is more important than speed. Now, as I get older, I wish I could get to some of these places a little more quickly, but even when you run into the wind, you are moving forward. You just don't feel it quite as well. So I think we're making some progress. I just wish we could get there a little bit faster. I mean, I think some of the things that I have seen, part of it is a result of COVID, quite frankly, but at least when we get an opportunity, when I say we, I mean folks that are sort of preaching what we're preaching around sports sampling and physical literacy development and multi-sport play, is that people buy in. The challenge then becomes finding local communities that are willing to adapt some of it or put forth some philosophical language around it, and then not have it just be talk, but actually program for it or change some of their approaches. But when we have the opportunity, people are doing it. The other thing that I think is probably has been really good, and you just referenced it, Joe, in terms of appreciation of the approach that Nate and I were bringing, was I think there's an emphasis on quality coaching that has shifted more from X's and O's to a more holistic approach to coaching, and a recognition that we actually coach the whole child, right? And that it's just part. So one of the things I did a couple of years ago is I came up with a coaching sort of construct that I call the CARE path. And CARE is an acronym that stands for culture, ability, relationships, and enjoyment, right? So culture, ability, relationships, enjoyment, CARE, but ability is only 25%. Now, any sport we coach, we have to do skills. We have to do technical, tactical. But most coaching platforms now I've seen over the past 5 to 8 years, and I think, a lot of credit to Wade Gilbert, and then some folks at the USOC that Chris Snyder in particular, who adapted some of this stuff, emphasis from Project Play on it, was really around coaching the whole child. So that has definitely been a trend that I've seen that's been a positive one. And I think most recently, probably, I'm preparing for a talk that I'm giving in a couple weeks, and it's around hybrid learning. So in my research, I've been talking to college coaches at the D1, D2, D3 level, athletic administrators at the college and at the high school level. And two things have happened as a result of COVID. Injuries are down. And one of the reasons injuries are down is because coaches aren't forcing athletes to play through injuries, right? And so I've got a good friend who runs one of the best cross-country programs in all of New England, if not the country. He's got 155 boys out. he said one of the coolest things was on the last race of the season that they had, all 155 boys towed the line. And what that means is that they were all healthy enough because he was able to back off some of the training so that they had the opportunity of running in the last race of the season, because that's unheard of in most situations. The other thing that I hope is going to be an outcome that the D2 and D3 coaches are saying is that they're seeing a regionalization of recruiting and of athletic contest. Because of budget cuts and because of wanting to reel in some things around health and safety, you're being forced to recruit in your backyard and play in your backyard. So we're not putting kids on 800-mile road trips to play the town 8 miles away. They're just playing the town 8 miles away, you know? And so I hope that that's something that is kind of a trickle down from that college necessity to people on the local level saying, yeah, why are we going to these national or statewide tournaments when we get there, we're playing people within a 30-mile radius of us anyway? So those are some positives I see that have come out in the past couple of years.
Nate, where do you see some advances?
There's a couple things that popped into my head. I think one of the biggest advances, and I think this is thanks to some of the organizations that are out there doing the work, you know, organizations like Project Play, Changing the Game Project, Inside Out Initiative, you know, these are the organizations kind of doing the vision work, the advocacy work. And I think that's really important, because I think one of the advances we've seen is that the academic message of long-term athletic development has started to reach the masses. It's started to become consumable and understandable to an average coach on the ground, an average family on the ground. I think we have a very, very long way to go. So I want to temper that enthusiasm of that as an advance. But you know, if you would go back 10 years, this kind of message wasn't out there. This kind of message wasn't being received by people on the ground. And so I think that has been a huge advance. It's slow, it's painfully slow. But that information has been converted into a format that the average person on the ground can consume, can understand, and can implement in their own life. And I think that's really important. I tend to believe in the power of market forces in our culture. And I think the only way we're really going to generate meaningful, lasting change is to change the demand on the ground. And I think this advocacy work and this message is really important in terms of changing that demand. And that kind of leads to my second point. And I would include 241 in this. We've had some real champions on the ground who have embraced that theory, who have embraced that method, who have embraced that style, and have found incredible success in doing so. Not just business success, developmental success. They have helped establish in their communities a new generation of kids who will ultimately become adults who intensely value movement and sport. And that shouldn't be overlooked. There is a business element to that too, which I don't want to overlook either. And that is, when the narrative is that 70% of kids are quitting sport by the time they're 12 or 13 years old, when overuse injury is out of control. There's a recent statistic by Project Play that 30% of kids who stopped playing sports during the pandemic have no intention of returning. These are significant issues that we're facing in terms of helping to encourage a healthy generation of kids coming up. So for organizations that are trying to determine, how do we stem the tide? How do we increase participation? How do we provide greater access to more families and more kids? We can hold up examples from around the country. We can hold up these champions and say, look, not only are they using these long-term athletic development concepts to promote healthy development in the kids that participate with them, but it's also having the effect of increasing access. It's also having the effect of increasing participation. which is ultimately good for kids, good for families, and good for business. So the organizations that are doing well in this environment, they're increasing participation, not declining in participation. They're finding business success. It's no coincidence that those are the same organizations that have embraced a long-term athletic development vision for their program. It's that's another advance. We've seen some meaningful organizations really drive impact in their communities, leveraging these concepts within their organization and within their programs. And I think the more we can hold up those programs as examples for others to follow, I think the better off we'll be in perpetuating this movement forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We do need to shine the spotlight on those programs, don't we? So that they can be used as a model and as a template as well for others who are trying to, implement in their community, school, or organization. Nate, I want to stick with you because at one point in time you said, yeah, but we still have a long way to go. We have these advances, but we have a long way to go. What do you think some of the challenges are that remain?
I think youth sports in general is still very much an echo chamber. I think we spend a lot of time talking to each other, listening to each other, and that's great in one sense. But in terms of moving the movement forward, I think we have to reach a new audience. And perhaps 2020 has made me a little more cynical than I had been previously. But I'm honestly very, very tired of the echo chamber. I think we need to do more to reach those who are capable of moving the dial. And I don't think it's people necessarily like myself or like Steve or like any local organizer to move the dial. I think what moves the dial is changing hearts of parents, coaches, kids. And once we change those hearts, having a viable program to match them with. So I think there has to be a lot more to break out of those echo chambers. We've got to take those advocacy messages, break out of those echo chambers, and somehow continue to make that consumable to the average parent who likely is not even looking for that information. And I think that's what we don't realize. I think we make the assumption, those of us on youth sports Twitter and all that, I think we make the assumption that parents are seeking this information. They're not. They're just trying to keep their family healthy. They're trying to hold down their full-time job. They're trying to get kids from one place to another. They're trying to juggle sports, band, art, dance, everything. They're not seeking this information out. So how do we reach people with a vision of what a healthy physical activity or youth sports experience looks like, and why that should be meaningful to their family, and why that should be a priority to their family when they're not seeking it? I think that's a big issue that we've got to solve. It does us no good to convince each other. We have to reach more hearts and minds on the ground, and then simultaneously have programs of impact within reach of those families so that they can access them. Once they understand why it's important, then they have to have an opportunity to match that with a program that fulfills that vision. And I think that's the challenge ahead. We have to do two things: reach those hearts and minds, but also generate more programs on the ground to reach them.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, this is the what are the challenges question, I suppose, right? And so Nate's spot on. I think part of the challenge with the echo chamber is that the conversation very much is generally, and I think even the way you were referring to it is generally to a middle class audience, right? And so I think part of what we've got to recognize is that regardless of socioeconomic status, rural, urban, suburban, kids are at schools. And so to me, the missed opportunity on the regular basis, and I think it's actually been highlighted as a result of COVID, is that we don't go where kids are, right? We send kids home from the place they are, and then that we're talking about developing. The challenge right now is coordination of municipality and school systems. And if you are in a private school world, well, then God bless you, but then you can do that internally. And municipality, parks and rec, if you will, and travel systems, private organizations. How do we coordinate those three? And how do we do it, like you said, Joe? How do we highlight where it's working well? I mean, obviously, when Nate was doing what he was doing in Appleton, he did it so well that people were trying to replicate it. They were trying to say, oh, what was the secret sauce? And you know, Google sauce is, and we can touch on some of those things. But at the end of the day, it's having a solid plan and looking to work together and in a collaborative way. If we're going to make this happen, we often will talk about top down, bottom up, right? And we all believe, because we're grassroots, that bottom up is where the magic happens. Yet we all know that top down matters, because that's where funding comes from and that's where influence comes from. And so we have to pay attention to those pieces. I think, and this is one of the things I'm going to try to commit to in 2021 that's different, is that when we can identify who are the members of top down and who are the members of bottom up, we either got to be super focused on getting that level of support or getting that level of programming initiated, or let's focus on getting those people to work better together, right? So, I mean, if we take somebody like, I don't know, the NCAA, ESPN, and Sports Engine, which is a competitor probably, I think you would say, of Nate's League Apps, but they're part of NBC. So you could look at those three organizations and say, okay, there's an interconnectedness between the three of them. So but let's recognize there's also a competitive piece between the three of them to some extent, but they all depend on each other. And I think part of the missed opportunity is how do we help people see win-win-win situations as much as possible? We have to enter every situation, whether it's top down or bottom up, where we take a win-win-win approach. As coaches, that's what we're always trying to do, right? Is how do we maximize all of our players so that they all have a positive experience, that the eventual outcome is going to be what met in enterprise and in the way we approach long-term athlete development and trying to create sustainable change. I think that would be different, because I'm not sure that's what everybody does in the echo chamber, quite frankly. So sorry, it was a little bit of a soapbox.
This is meant to be a little bit of a soapbox, isn't it? Hey, one thing that I heard both of you talk about was the echo chamber. So getting to this last part of this episode, we want to kind of talk about solutions, right? Like, what kind of things do we need to do to solve some of these challenges and issues and problems that we have brought up? And you talked about the echo chamber, and I totally agree with you on this as well. But what advice do you have for those people who are listening, who they're part of the echo chamber as well, aren't they? If they're listening to this, they're probably going to be part of the echo chamber. So what advice can you give, Nate, to these individuals, to help propagate this idea, this concept, this framework of long-term athletic development in their own communities?
Yeah. So Tom Ferry at Project Play has a phrase that he likes to use when we talk, and it's something along the lines of, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you do? And that's a good question for some things, because I think it gets us to think big and grand. And I think it's important that we think big and grand, but I think in terms of solutions, the solutions are probably far less dramatic and far less impressive and far more practical. And so I think we would do ourselves a lot of good by focusing more practically on the small things that we can do on the ground. And, I hear within the echo chamber, you hear a lot of talk about systematic change and about how we need this massive increase in funding, and we need the NGBs to give us more tools. And, all that probably would be very effective. And maybe someday we'll get some of that massive support. I, for one, am not counting on it. Again, I said earlier that I'm a little more cynical these days than I was earlier in the year. But I don't think that that should hold us back. Whether we get it or not, I don't think any of that should be holding us back. I think we have what we need right now to be able to push this movement forward and make change now. We just need to do it. I think solution number one, we need to quit waiting for others to do it. If we have it within us to do it ourselves, if we have it within us to make impact in our local community, within our local programs now, we need to do it. The resources are already there. There's already a ton of great lesson plans out there. Most of the NGBs, most of the pro sports leagues have already provided great youth materials that are LTAD friendly that we can access for actual programs right now if we want to. I think we need to quit waiting on I think we need to quit waiting on the local park and rec to change. I think we need to quit waiting on the local club to change. If something doesn't exist in your local community that suits the needs of the kids in your community right now, do it yourself, or pair yourself with others who feel similarly and just do it. I don't feel like we've done enough to empower those folks to just do it. And I think in terms of solutions, I think we could really help our cause by helping make people feel empowered to do it on their own. Make them realize they don't need the park and rec to buy in. It certainly will. And I know this is kind of an anti-message to what Steve shared earlier. And collaboration is great if we can get there. But I'll tell you what, if you're not waiting on those organizations to implement, if you go about that implementation yourself and you find success in doing so, you're going to find yourself being, you're going to get a lot of fresh attention. You're going to get a lot of fresh attention from that local park and rec who suddenly notices your success and wants to know what you're doing and wants to maybe do some of that themselves. You're going to notice a lot of attention from your local school district who wants to know what you're doing and wants to maybe implement some of that themselves. You're going to start finding those champions and those advocates. But I think it starts with action. I think we start with a lot of talk and conversation. I think we need more action. So I know that's not very specific, but I think we can do a lot within this movement to empower people on the ground to take action and make them help improve their confidence that they can do it themselves, either just them or with a couple of like-minded parents or with an administrator, just somebody who can be a champion in their communities, making them understand that they've got the tools and the means by which to accomplish that themselves. So I would say that's one solution. Sorry, I'm getting long-winded here, but a second solution kind of goes back to a point I made earlier. We need to continue to push the narrative forward. We need to continue this effort to take a relatively academic concept and make it more consumable to the average family. And I think this means a more mainstream approach. I think we need it in our local newspapers. We need it on our local TV stations. We need it on our local radio programs. We need this message coming through more and more and more on the ground in our local communities. And I think this can either be done through our national messengers themselves, or I think it can be done by using local champions as surrogates to get that message out. So I think that's critically important, is to feed families, coaches on the ground with the information, with the data, so that they understand why this approach to youth sports and youth athletic development is important. Not important just to the success of their program, but important to the kids and their healthy development moving forward. Not to mention, just healthy lifestyle for the families themselves. If that demand can be shifted, and sorry to be talking in economic terms, but if that demand can be shifted, the supply has to shift as well. And so I think we can compel that bottom-up approach more than we've done so far, but that means delivering that message, delivering those concepts, delivering that data straight to the hearts and minds of the parents who will participate in it.
Good. Steve, you may have something to say here about the echo chamber, and I'll give you some time to, maybe share some practical advice that you may have on the echo chamber. But I also want you to address one point that you brought up, and that's the coordination
Mhm.
of schools, municipalities, and private organizations. So if you have some other things to share about the echo chamber, I'm more than happy to hear it. And then let's get into
Yeah.
the coordination part as well.
Well, I think my answer to the echo chamber was probably going to encompass some of that. So I'll just go in that direction, because I think it is in support of what Nate just spoke about, right? Is that, even the way 241 was formed, it really came as a moment of outrage. And my wife and I said, hey, we can shout from the mountaintops, from the echo chamber, or we could actually do something about it given our roles. And so we came up with the tagline, life's too short for just one sport. We conceptualized a multi-sport camp. And ironically, initially when we did it, because she was at a private school, I used my public school coaching friends to turn it into a private school model. And I thought initially that that's what it was going to be. It was going to be a private school. Let's bring back the 3-season athlete, yada, yada, yada. But then we came to realize, no, this resonates and works in local municipalities, in inner city public schools, in public high schools around the country. And all of a sudden, we were able to morph and sort of amoeba-like change our approach and our model. And then we came to realize we understand systems. We understand the systemic pieces that the echo chamber complains about. And so it's funny, quick anecdote. When I first moved back from Seattle after having 3 years of teaching in New York, 3 years of teaching and coaching in Seattle as well, came back to Connecticut. My first job was working with the kids at risk of dropping out. My title was homeschool liaison, but it was through my counseling background. And so to connect with these kids, I figured out I'll take them to the local playground and we'll play some hoops. Asked the kids to organize themselves. I just said, let's play. Let's go ahead and split sides and let's play. And they've all looked at me like that I had two heads. And I realized they didn't know how to split sides. The adults had so micromanaged these kids. So then personally, I get to know some of them. And I sort of got to a T. When I would ask, what do they want to be when they grow up? They would say a professional athlete. And I'm like, Rob, how are you going to play professional football? Because basically, he literally thought it would just happen. But then when I would push him on it, I would be like, you didn't even go off for the high school football team. So how is it going to happen? So anecdotally, what I would say to a lot of folks a lot of people in the echo chamber are expecting everybody else to do it, right? They just assume. I mean, I think, I've talked to Tom Ferry about it. I think there's this assumption that they've got access to $1 gazillion and they can fund whatever. They don't have any money. I mean, what they do is they do have the support of Aspen, and they do have the platform to convene and to influence programs, but they don't have money. So I think a lot of people sit back and they wait for them to do something. They wait for the NCAA to make change. In the same way that last year when we were getting ready to do programming, I finally said, I'm not waiting for the CDC anymore because they're useless at this point in terms of giving some governance. So I think to Nate's point is, if you have capacity and influence in your local community, well, then use it, right? But if you don't, or you've tried that and you're getting doors shut, well, then do it yourself or just stop complaining. But what I think the other thing is the echo chamber could do, and Joe, I've always appreciated you and Tony and Rick for doing that, is bring the people together that are willing to collaborate and learn from each other and motivate each other, because that's what coaches do, right? As coaches, one of the greatest things we can do is hold each other accountable for our goals, right? And so that we're much more likely to follow through on goals, that we've set if we know we've got someone that is holding us accountable to do it. And I think that's part of what we can do for each other in a very collegial way, not in a, hey, you said you were going to do this, how come you didn't follow through sort of way, but in the way we would nurture our players to say, hey, you know what, you set a goal, you haven't reached it yet. Let's do a reset. Let's figure out why, and then let's go after it that way. So look, I think that we have reason for optimism, right? But we need doers. We need people to stop just complaining and waiting for others to do it, right? And And look, I get caught up in one, and I said this earlier, I want everything to happen more quickly, right? I do want those top-down people to put money into programs where I think they can have some influence and greater influence. But at the end of the day, all the stuff has to happen locally. Everything happens locally. Now, the fact that we are now in Vancouver, Canada, and Denver, and we're going to be hopefully in Appleton, Wisconsin, and in Carolina, now our locals are starting to become more national. But the only way that happened was we acted on that moment of outrage. Over time, we are now influencing more local markets to have a more global impact. I hope that makes sense for people, is that let's bring it back to long-term athlete development, right? I mean, I think we all wish we could turn our kids and our players into superstars overnight, but that doesn't happen. There's a decade. And now I've had the opportunity to impact some local communities in China, in Canada, around the United States, because I acted on the moment of outrage. Did I think it would happen more quickly? Absolutely. Because that's what we do, right? We wake up and we're athletes and we think we can do it. But when I look back on it, I realize there's a great expression. People severely overestimate what they can get done in a year. I think it was Timothy Robbins who I heard this from. Severely overestimate what they can get done in a year, but they severely underestimate what they can get done in a decade. And I think that's synonymous to long-term athlete development, right? Is that, think about that. That is, we look at 2020. God, it was an awful year for so many of us, right? And because we severely overestimate. But let's look back at 2030 on how good this decade could be if we learn from 2020 and we actually allow it to be the impetus, the building blocks that Nate was referring to actually do something special. So anyway, I do think there's reason for optimism in this space, but I'm counting on others, including myself, to get up every day and continue to fight the battle.
Yeah, super. Guys, thanks to both of you for sharing this conversation about long-term athletic development, the challenges that we have, some of the issues, some of the opportunities, and then last but not least, some of the solutions. Steve, I too am optimistic and will continue to be optimistic as we close out 2020 and kind of look forward to 2021 and beyond. So again, guys, thanks for being on. If listeners do want to follow up with you, where can they reach you?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add one more thought to
Yep.
Steve's last point, which was phenomenal. And I agree wholeheartedly. And I think we do need more doers. And I think that's the silver lining here too. And that is, we tend to talk about the echo chamber in a negative sense, but there's a real positive element to that too, and that the echo chamber is filled with potential champions. Mm-hmm. If we can inspire confidence and motivation to act upon that thought process and implement solutions on the ground. And so I think that's the challenge is, okay, how can we make more champions willing to bypass the resistance, willing to bypass the hesitancy, willing to bypass the lukewarm reception, and just do it. And I think that's the challenge for all of us who have done it. It's like, how can we take that experience as entrepreneurs, as program leaders, and how can we use that to inspire more action in more communities? That will trigger more interest. That will trigger more opportunities for collaboration. As a 15-year entrepreneur myself, I found during that time that much more collaboration came at the back end of that rather than at the front end. You walk in somewhere with this crazy, wild idea, no one's willing to hop on board with that. But if you prove the relevance of it, if you prove the concept, everyone's willing to get on board with it after the fact. And so I think, that kind of gets to the collective action idea. Maybe we've been going about collective action all wrong. Maybe we're trying to lead into collective action rather than trying to come out with collective action on the back end. I think we need, to Steve's point, I think we need more doers. And through doing successfully, we're going to organically create opportunities for collective action. And I think that's probably a great theme then to go into 2021 with, is that more doing, less talking. That's been the tagline of our last 10 years though, right? So perhaps this is the year, maybe using a difficult 2020 as our springboard. I hope 2021 is a year of more acting and less doing. Best way to get in touch with me, I'm fairly active on Twitter. I'm at nbaldwin75. Anyone's welcome to email me personally as well. I'm at nbaldwin1975@gmail.com.
And myself, everything at 241 Sports is, for Twitter, for Instagram, and for Facebook. LinkedIn, Steve Boyle. I probably am on LinkedIn as much as I am Twitter. I try to get active on Twitter, and I'm at Steve Boyle 241 for that one. And then also email Steve at 241sports.com. Always love to connect with people, and happy to hop on a call and see if we can learn from each other. So thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. And Nate, my apologies for not letting you follow up on that. And those last points were really solid as well. So I'm really glad that you shared those. So yeah, just to close out here, guys, thanks again. Best wishes in 2021 and beyond.
You too. Thanks for having us on.